Good morning. I'm Katie Kingery-Page, a member of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Manhattan. We have no required creed here. We believe in the liberal ideal that each person find his, her, their own path, whether it is working toward inner peace, particular social justice goals, or other religious destinations. And so I welcome you, whatever path brought you here today. I ask you to join us with an open heart and open mind, and I greet you with the same. If you're new to our fellowship, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. If you're curious about what we're about or what Unitarian Universalism in general is like, I encourage you to talk with people after the service. Everyone is invited to enjoy virtual coffee and conversation after the service. If you'd like a member of the congregation to reach out and share more about UUFM, please let us know in the chat. Our member, Shirley Hobrock, is here today as a greeter and would love to follow up with you. The chalice is a symbol of our commitment to create a more just world. Today, as I light this sort of chalice, I will read Connection and Commitment by Reverend Cynthia Landrum. As we kindle this flame, may it spark in each of us connection and commitment to this living tradition and to each other. Our opening hymn is Fire of Commitment, performed by our music director, Renee Reisner. Now I invite you into a breakout room to greet your fellow UUs and have some time in fellowship. You should see a pop-up any moment that will invite you to join a breakout. Welcome back from the breakout rooms. Our story for all ages today is The Promise by Nicola Davies. On a mean street in a mean, broken city, a young girl tries to snatch an old woman's bag, but the frail old woman, holding on with the strength of heroes, says the thief can't have it without giving something in return. The promise. It is the beginning of a journey that will change the thieving girl's life and a chance to change the world for good.
When I was young, I lived in a city that was mean and hard and ugly. Its streets were dry as dust, cracked by heat and cold, and never blessed with rain. A gritty yellow wind blew constantly, scratching round the buildings like a hungry dog. Nothing grew. Everything was broken. No one ever smiled. The people had grown as mean and hard and ugly as their city. And I was mean and hard and ugly too. I lived by stealing from those who had almost as little as I did. My heart was as shriveled as the dead trees in the park. And then, one night, I met an old lady down a dark street. She was frail and alone, an easy victim. Her bag was fat and full, but when I tried to take it from her, she held on with the strength of heroes. To and fro we pulled that bag until at last she said, "If you promise to plant them, then I'll let go." What did she mean? I didn't know or care. I just wanted the bag. So I said, "All right, I promise." She loosened her grip at once and smiled at me. I ran off without a backward look, thinking of the food and money in the bag. But when I opened it, there were only acorns, so green, so perfect, and so many. And I understood the promise I had made. I held a forest in my arms, and my heart was changed. I forgot the food and money, and for the first time in my life, I felt lucky, rich beyond my wildest dreams. I slept with the acorns for my pillow, my head full of leafy visions. And in the morning, I began to keep my promise. I planted beside roads, on roundabouts, among rubble, ruins and rusty railings, by train tracks, tram lines and traffic lights, in abandoned parks and gardens laced with broken glass, behind factories and shopping malls, at bus stops, cafes, blocks of flats. I pushed aside the mean and the hard and the ugly, and I planted. Nothing changed at first. The gritty wind still scratched the parched, cracked streets. The people scowled and scuttled to their homes like cockroaches. But slowly, shoots of green began to show. Trees, first here, then there, then everywhere. People came onto the streets to see. They touched the leaves in wonder, and they smiled. They took tea together by the tiny trees. They talked and laughed, and pretty soon they were planting too. Trees and flowers, fruit and vegetables in parks and gardens, on balconies and rooftops. Green spread through the city like a song, breathing to the sky, drawing down the rain like a blessing. But by then, I was already far away, planting in another sad and sorry city. And another, and another, and another. And then, last night, in a lonely alley, a young thief fought me for my bag of acorns. I smiled and made the old bargain, knowing how a heart can change, knowing that my planting will go on.
If you are proud of this fellowship, become its advocate. If you are concerned for its future, share its message. If its values resonate deep within you, give it a measure of your devotion. This fellowship cannot survive without your faith, your confidence, your enthusiasm. Its destiny, the larger hope, rests in your hands. You can donate online at uufm.net. Please be aware that unless you designate your offering for pledge or general fund, it will be given to uplift our March Helping Hands recipient, the Wonder Workshop. During the offertory, please place in the chat any joys or concerns that you may have on your mind or in your heart today. I will share these joys and concerns after the offertory. I'm going to share a reading. These words come from contemporary theologian Caspar Terculli. Our dominant cultural values shape our conception of community, which means that we seek, even in community, self-actualization, personal freedom, and individual success exhibited through consumption. As historian Guy Ortolano explains, market liberalism succeeds when indifferent, even hostile actors, such as community institutions, internalize its priorities. While we want community, it is often community on our terms, with easy entrances and exits, lots of choice and support, and minimal responsibilities, writes Christine Pohl in her book, Living into Community, Cultivating Practices That Sustain Us. It would be so much easier if we could be connected without being encumbered, despite the fact that many of us claim to be dissatisfied with individualism. We cherish our capacity to make individual choices and to seek opportunities for personal growth. Communities in which we grow and flourish last over time and are built by people who are faithful to one another and committed to a shared purpose. Community life certainly has moments of incredible beauty and intense personal connection, but much of it is daily and ordinary. Our lives are knit together not so much by intense feeling as by shared history, tasks, commitments, stories, and sacrifices. We are honored today to have Andrew Elliot of Mutual Aid MHK join us to share a reflection. Mutual Aid MHK is a grassroots network of community members, all expressing solidarity through mutual aid. If you need support, we will strive to find it for you. If you can offer support, we will do our best to coordinate you with those who need it. That is the credo of Mutual Aid MHK. Welcome, Andrew.
Hey, thank you so much. I am really very genuinely excited and grateful to have this opportunity to talk about mutual aid with everyone today. This is just a very beautiful group of people, and I'm genuinely honored to be here and share what we're doing. So, as Katie said, my name is Andrew Elliot. I'm a volunteer with Mutual Aid MHK, and I'm going to give a brief overview of the kind of work that we're doing. First, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So in talking about Mutual Aid MHK, I'm going to describe what we do, what mutual aid support looks like in practice, how we do it, and why we do it. I also want to briefly share some research with everyone regarding the impact and efficacy of universal direct assistance, which is the type of service that Mutual Aid MHK provides. And then lastly, I want to spend a moment elaborating on your theme of commitment at UUFM and how it relates, I think, really profoundly with mutual aid at this particular point in time. And with that, let's get started. So, Mutual Aid MHK is a volunteer-run universal direct assistance program that organized and launched in April 2020. And in our 11 months of operation, we've provided immediate short-term support to economically vulnerable community members in Manhattan. Now, the margin of support that we provide can spare folks from having their lives spiral out of control due to compounding debt. And it also helps people avoid needing mid to long-term support from other organizations, which reduces pressure on those organizations and enables them to focus on their target populations and their areas of expertise. And as a result, that can just save those other organizations and our community more broadly critical financial resources. We work with our community's most vulnerable members as a target demographic. So this includes folks who are socioeconomically and or politically marginalized, undocumented, elderly, LGBTQ, low income. It is effectively anyone that's in need, anyone that requests support. And to date, we've supported about 170 individuals by connecting them to vital resources and support in times of heightened vulnerability. But the scope of our work is vastly larger than that. According to data from the American Census Survey, the Flint Hills Wellness Coalition, and the American Community Survey, about 21% of Riley County's population, that's about 14,000 people, have been determined to be in poverty. And it's important to remember that those data represent ACS information from 2018, right? This is prior to the impacts of COVID-19. So there is a very large demographic of people that are in need of support in Manhattan. The support we offer takes a pretty vast variety of forms. So mutual aid can look like immediate financial support of up to $150 for things like rent and utilities, but it's also the work of our support network. And in that, we've got folks that run errands for people, deliver groceries and fuel. We've got folks that repair vehicles and household appliances, cook and deliver meals. We've even got some people providing storage and housing for individuals that have been made homeless due to either prolonged unemployment or unstable employment due to the pandemic. Now, we do this to prevent folks from slipping into crisis and to prevent or mitigate a secondary threat for economically vulnerable folks, which is compounding debt due to late fees and interest. And because we're both volunteer run and operate without means testing, we're able to fill in gaps in our community's social safety net. And most of those gaps are due to those two things: means testing, which is criteria for receiving support, and programmatic latency. Regarding that term, programmatic latency, I want to unpackage that for everyone a little bit because it's a bit jargony. And I'm going to do that by giving you all a concrete example of how mutual aid works as a process. An example that's the sort of thing that we see with, unfortunately, pretty high frequency. And in that, I also want to illustrate how compounding debt affects this kind of work. So, an example. Lisa is behind on rent and utilities, and she's struggling to pay for groceries. She lost her job in August. She's laid off due to the pandemic, and she found 2 part-time jobs in November, but she has taken a pay cut even with the net income of both. And she's fallen behind on bills. So now she needs about $400 for rent and another $100 for utilities. In scenario A, she reaches out to conventional support in Manhattan. That would most likely in this instance be something like Shepherd's Crossing. So Lisa needs financial aid now. She has bills that are due at the end of the week. It's a Friday. So she tries to set up an appointment at Shepherd's Crossing that day. But Shepherd's Crossing is only taking appointments on Tuesdays between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. or Thursdays between 2 and 5:30 p.m. So she has to wait until she can go, fill out the required paperwork, and just have her circumstances vetted. So the soonest Shepherd's Crossing can do that is next Tuesday. But Lisa can't schedule an appointment for next Tuesday or Thursday in the upcoming week because Shepherd's Crossing's appointments are during work hours. So she has to wait another week before she's effectively given permission to take off work. And her bills are due next Friday. So she's going to be late on those. She takes off work for that next Tuesday appointment, but that is a pay cut for Lisa. She finally gets in and she gets set up with a long-term plan to get out of debt. And Shepherd's Crossing is going to work with her to holistically sort that out. And it'd be clear they do a really excellent job of that. But in the turnaround time of all of that, that is the programmatic latency that I'm speaking about. That $100 utility bill, along with the rest of her bills, have taken on a compounding effect. What was a need for $500 is now being exacerbated by late fees and growing interest. So now she needs something like $700. And it's important to remember that just like Lisa's unemployment and overall circumstances, none of this is her fault. In fact, in this instance, this compounding debt is the result of programmatic latency at Shepherd's Crossing. And that latency is coming from means testing and limited operating hours. Now, Shepherd's Crossing may even be able to take care of that increased amount of debt, but it costs them about 40% more purely because of programmatic latency and means testing. Let's look at a different possibility. Lisa reaches out to Mutual Aid MHK. So we receive either a voicemail, a text, a Google form from Lisa stating that she needs rent and utility assistance. If her need is at or above $150, we immediately provide her with that money. We then refer her to programs like Shepherd's Crossing. And in this instance, it would most definitely be Shepherd's Crossing. And because we can provide immediate small-scale financial support 7 days a week, she avoids or reduces the compounding effect of late fees. So the intensity of her financial crisis, it gets reduced. And Shepherd's Crossing is now looking at addressing a financial plan for about $330 in this particular example. That's about a 30% reduction in the total resources needed by both Shepherd's Crossing and Mutual Aid MHK. So it's just a more efficient use of community resources. And it's important to emphasize here that that efficiency is contingent upon using both universal direct assistance programs like Mutual Aid MHK and qualified and targeted support programs like Shepherd's Crossing. Now, that is a rough sketch of the kind of thing we're doing at Mutual Aid MHK, but I want to spend a moment and explain why we are doing this kind of work. And this boils down to how we understand inequity. And I'll elaborate briefly on how this informs our orientation. And to do that, we need to contextualize what's happening with the pandemic. People right now are struggling not because COVID-19 rearranged a healthy, functioning economic and social system. They are struggling because that system already had massive, pretty inhumane gaps built into it, gaps that this pandemic has merely exposed and amplified. In an interdependent and interconnected global system, which is the kind of world we live in, inequity cannot be understood as a problem that only people in poverty experience. Inequity is also the experience of people doing well, amassing wealth, or having better outcomes and well-being within the exact same system. So when people use this tagline for mutual aid, solidarity, not charity, this is what we mean. We're saying in an interdependent system, in an interdependent world, we all have a part to play in either contributing to or changing inequity. And I can also share with you that there is critical need for universal direct assistance right here in Manhattan. There are countless folks who are doing everything they can just to survive in this environment. And conventional approaches from federal stimulus to local responses are failing enormous parts of our community. So Mutual Aid MHK is a ground level response to this problem, both in the context of the pandemic and the inequities that existed before it that still need to be addressed. Okay, as I mentioned up front, I also want to share some of the research that exists on the impact of universal direct assistance. So right now, there's some compelling research that examines the role and efficacy of universal direct assistance programs, which is, again, the type of service that we're offering at Mutual Aid MHK. For example, there's a research group called the Workers Lab. They've conducted a study to assess the impact of direct cash transfers on the gig economy. So think Uber, DoorDash, Eat Street, those sort of gig workers. And that work is being spearheaded by corporations and foundations like Google and the Rockefeller Foundation. And what they find is that individuals who receive universal direct assistance in the form of cash transfers to gig workers in this particular instance, they have the ability to prevent or to mitigate the cascading effect of unexpected ongoing crises, such as unemployment and compounding debt. A similar program in Stockton, California, gave people in neighborhoods at or below Stockton's median household income, they gave those people a guaranteed income. So they selected 125 people. They gave them $500 a month for 2 years, from February 2019 until just this last February. It's crazy timing. And these were unconditional cash transfers given as prepaid debit cards, meaning recipients could spend that money on whatever they wanted to. The results, based on a randomized control trial, indicated that recipients obtained full-time employment at more than twice the rate of non-recipients. They were less anxious and depressed, both over time and compared to the control group. They also saw statistically significant improvements in their emotional health, fatigue levels, just their overall well-being. And they had a greater ability to pay for unexpected expenses. There is some more conventional research on universal cash transfers as well, and it includes things like aggregate data from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And that research very consistently finds that when people have full freedom to choose what to spend aid on, they do it effectively, and they tend to know how to prioritize what financial barriers they need to address. Now, I'm sharing this research because when I talk about mutual aid with folks who are either new to or maybe uncomfortable with the idea of universal direct assistance, I very consistently hear one question. And I mean, I hear it almost every time I talk about it. What about bad faith actors? What about people who would abuse this kind of support? And my first response to that is just to steer folks away from their beliefs about what economically marginalized or vulnerable people could do with this type of assistance, and point to evidence that tells us what they actually do with this support. And it very clearly indicates two things. The first is that concerns of impoverished and marginalized people systematically abusing cash transfers are statistically baseless, and they're often exaggerated. And the second is that unqualified universal direct financial assistance is consistently observed to have a broad range of positive results for recipients. I can also tell everyone that this approach works empirically right here in Manhattan. I've been a volunteer coordinator for Mutual Aid MHK since April of last year. And from that experience, with some confidence, I can say when people have fewer obstacles to receiving support when they need it, their outcomes are just better. When there aren't qualifications on how people utilize their capital, they tend to make decisions that are in their best interest. Now, I want to share a few basic things about how you can support the work that we're doing. More than anything, we need more people involved in Mutual Aid MHK, and we need more donations. We've raised and distributed about $9,000 since April of 2020, but with the ongoing impact of the pandemic, we continue to see folks that have urgent need for financial aid. And as of right now, like literally as of today, we have a backlog of about $7,000 in requests. So the rate at which we are able to offer universal direct assistance, in this case is financial aid, that has to keep pace with the request that we receive. If it does not, people realize that we aren't able to offer that kind of support and our visibility drops. Inversely, when we have funds, we see an increase in requests from new community members and our network grows. I will link donation information in the chat afterwards. and make sure that that info gets emailed or just gets out to everybody. We also need more people just involved in this work more generally. We need folks to expand our community outreach and engagement and to help with promotion. And we also need, we need folks to get involved and help us expand our fundraising efforts. All of that is just to say that while we've managed to do a great deal in our first year, the potential of this work is not being fully realized in Manhattan. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to onboard folks in Manhattan to the idea of universal direct assistance in this past year. And I can tell you that there is some ideological resistance to mutual aid. It initially appears as skepticism about giving money to people experiencing poverty without any qualifications. Or again, it gets voiced as concern for bad faith actors. But after I present folks with evidence that indicates that those concerns are pretty baseless, I rarely see any change in their orientation to mutual aid. And I think that's because there's something deeper than the surface level skepticism that people express about things like mutual aid. And I believe that that has to do largely with a very strong internalization of a charity-centric worldview. And this is problematic because the primary conventional drivers for providing grant funding, donations, human resources for this kind of work, all that operates typically through a framework of charity. And these are organizations that I'm sure you're all familiar with, such as the Greater Manhattan Community Foundation, the Catholic Charities, and Shepherd's Crossing. All of them have heard variations of this information that I've shared with you today, and each of them has rejected the idea of financially supporting universal direct assistance, specifically as mutual aid. And this is troubling because in instances like GMCF, part of their funding is taxpayer subsidized. In terms of securing federal grant funding, the city of Manhattan has actually put GMCF in charge of allocating funds for things like CARES stimulus to nonprofit organizations. That is a really serious problem for this kind of work. If one of Manhattan's only sources of publicly funded financial support for this kind of thing, if they reject the premise of universal direct assistance based on their beliefs about how to address poverty despite contrary evidence, it just sort of doesn't leave any room for this work to grow. And I think that warrants a closer look at the framework of charity. So the vast majority of Manhattan's social safety net programs, charities, faith-based support communities, and their funding sources orient to poverty and inequity with value systems that emphasize personal accountability or things like self-actualization theory. Now, these are all models of altruism that see people experiencing poverty as possessing distinct qualities as individuals that result in their poverty. And in that framework, poverty is described as a consequence of choice and of character. It's something that happens to certain kinds of people, right? Poor people are poor. It suggests that the victims of systems that keep people in debt and poverty, that those victims are responsible for overcoming the policies and obstacles of that same system. It also refuses to recognize that those same people have virtually no economic or political power to influence policy or change their circumstances. The charity-oriented view also fails to just mention or address any system-level variables that create poverty. Instead, it tells people in poverty who are working multiple jobs and in desperate circumstances that they need to be more responsible. And I liken this to telling someone who's just had their home set on fire by someone else that they need to do a better job of putting their house's fire out, rather than addressing the problem of people who are setting homes on fire. And that, I believe that's just a fundamentally pathological way to relate to people. From a systems perspective that recognizes things like starvation wages, unchecked living costs, and decades of excessive taxpayer subsidies for private corporations and industry, poverty is a designed condition, and it's reinforced by economic and legal policies. It marginalizes the majority of people in our society in order to exploit, control, and misrepresent the value of their labor, to the benefit of a minority class of wealthy, privileged individuals who also misrepresent their own value in society. And in that holistic view, The ideologies of charity or things like self-actualization, they become complicit in maintaining inequity. They preserve injustice. They fail to recognize or they ignore the drivers of systemic poverty, and they offer no meaningful ethical solutions. Community well-being, equity, and solidarity, those things are a fundamental sea change away from that kind of orientation. And that is precisely the orientation and practice that Mutual Aid MHK has. And I can tell you it works, but we need people. We really desperately need people to help create an ideological change here in Manhattan, away from pathologizing and shaming poverty as an individual's punishment or their responsibility, and towards a view that really sincerely recognizes the interconnectedness of systems of wealth and privilege to parallel systems of poverty and exploitation. And when we act from that place of understanding, then we're able to make real improvements to the equity and well-being of our communities. Okay, to wrap up, I want to briefly talk about the theme of commitment and how it relates to everything I've shared with you all today. Specifically, I want to talk about the role commitment has in guiding and realizing our values, how it can inform our ideals and allow us to really to realize our best selves. And even further, how commitment can position our ideal self and values into a practice as something like community. And all of that, I believe, is embodied in the idea of community, to share and nurture our connection with one another towards the realization that our most fulfilled individual self is interwoven with our collective well-being. So, what is it then to be committed to this idea of community? A community with profound disparities cannot be made just without equity. And in complex, interdependent systems like communities, solidarity is one of the most direct paths to creating equity and to realizing justice. Mutual aid and its guiding values of equity and solidarity, that is a profoundly powerful way to practice commitment to the idea of community. And I think a really critical aspect and value of commitment is also summoning courage to ask really challenging questions, to reflect on our behaviors, our values, and the world around us, and to see to what extent these are all in alignment. Even further, when we identify a lack of alignment or a lack of harmony because we learned something new or our perspective grows and changes, that we then go beyond that realization, beyond questioning, beyond reflection, and act to create integration, to restore harmony, and to honor our commitment to our values so that we can shape and transform our world from one of unnecessary disparity and injustice to one that embodies our very best ideals. Okay, I'm going to put my soapbox away now, and yeah, I think that's probably my time. So I just want to wrap up by saying, thank you all very much for your time and attention. If there's time for questions or comments, or maybe after this service, I'm more than happy to listen to them and get involved in that conversation. Otherwise, thank you for letting me talk about mutual aid with you all today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And just one quick question, because I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds. What's the best way to get involved with Mutual Aid MHK?
Do you mean like a specific role, or how to get in touch with us?
Yes.
Yeah. Email us at what are we? My brain is blanking on the most basic thing after that. I think we are mutualaid.mhk@gmail.com. Shoot us an email and we will get back to you pretty instantaneously, I suspect.
Thank you. We appreciate you so much, Andrew. This was a wonderful presentation. Our closing hymn today is "We Are a Gentle, Angry People."
We are a gentle, angry and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and all together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and all together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gay and straight together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gay and straight together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
Our closing words come from Israel Bufardi. The struggle continues. The road that lies ahead of us is a long one, and the pace of progress will sometimes feel glacially slow. Never forget that glaciers, over time, can carve out grand canyons and great lakes. Moving tectonic plates can rise up mountains over millennia, or they can explode awe-inspiring volcanoes in milliseconds. Our commitment to love and justice can do the same. I'd like to invite you now into virtual coffee and conversation breakout rooms to reflect upon today's service and for fellowship. You should see a pop-up in just a moment inviting you to a breakout room.